Thank you very much. We had a very vibrant session that we did not have enough time. I don't think we had conclusions, but we have takeaways from the discussions that we had from the 4 papers, which were a good representation of the continent, because we had papers with cases from different countries: Kenya, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, and Nigeria. They all brought different contexts, reminding us that Africa is not one. So we have different contexts that we need to examine and analyze. From the panel, which was titled Religion, Culture, and Democracy in Present Africa, we discussed about the positive and negative influence of religion in the democratization process. We had a case of Kenya, for example, whereby the Council of Churches was the case in point, and we saw how in 1980s and early 1990s it had really positive role in promoting democratic ideals in the country, in questioning the state, in speaking truth to the power. But it has changed the role now, and from the paper's analysis, the role is not very positive at the moment. So this is one of the examples of how religion can play both sides of the coin. But we also learned that religion can mobilize for democracy if it can be empowered, in the sense that when we have very strong civil society that can support religion in recognizing the potential and the potential and the role that religion can play, the positive role that religion can play, given that religion has a lot of followers, many people in African countries religious, they still have strong belief. They also respect. Again, we also talked about respect, but they respect religion leaders and they listen to religion leaders. So if we recognize and appreciate that potential of religion and support religious institutions, religious leaders in empowering them, involving them in democratic discussion or discussion about democracy, civil liberties, etc., we can actually realize this positive role of religion. But also, we need to work with religious leaders in the same manner. In our panel, we talked a lot about culture. And here we had a very critical discussion with regards to culture. And this discussion emanated from the argument that there is an issue of respect, whereby in most African cultures, respect is a virtue that we are taught from when we are young. You have to respect your elders, you have to respect your parents, and that can have some negative impact when it comes to questioning and speaking truth to the power. And because of that, we had a lot of questions about, first and foremost, what is an African culture? So we asked ourselves those questions. We looked at the global norms versus Ubuntu, but we also, just towards the end, it came up, we came up with something that can remind us of Orientalism. Why do we speak about African culture when, about culture when it comes to the African context, while we are not speaking the same when we are talking about Western world? So whenever issues of culture and democracy are discussed, the context is often either Asia or Africa. And these were some of the questions or critical questions that came out of the discussions. So as I said, we did not have a conclusion, but we had a lot of questions to ask. And personally, I do research on religion and development of religion and state, and I'm impressed that this is the second time, again last year and this year, we are discussing about religion and democracy, and I think it's something that all of us who are trying to drive or to promote democracy in the continent, we should really keep on discussing and thinking through on how we can realize the potential of religion by engaging religious leaders, religious institutions into the discussion of democracy so that we can all speak the same song. But also, I would say again, in relation to that, the general conclusion would be we need to question and keep on asking and supporting or helping religious organizations and leaders to be drivers for democracy and to work with them rather than sidelining them or ignoring them in the name of maybe we only want to make religion private. No, we cannot, because it has a lot of influence. Thank you.
Thank you. So fortunately or unfortunately, your presentation has elicited a question from the online audience. So I'd request, yeah, there's a question that we'd like you to contend with. My colleagues in IT, please help us put up the question. It states, I can recall from memory, why is religion no longer speaking truth to power in Kenya? I'm sure that came up in your conversation.
Oh, maybe we can send that paper to the person who has asked the question. But Mutie, are you here? Because I don't want to speak for you. Dr. Mutie, yeah. Dr. Mutie can answer that question because he's the one who brought that argument. Yeah? You have a mic there. Come quickly. I don't want to speak for you. I might misquote you. Because he had a lot of factors that he outlined. Quick, you just come up here. It's okay, we're in the same panel. We are democratic.
Okay, thank you very much to that question, for this, the person who is asking that question. Yes, one thing that we know, something that has happened is that religion, there is what we are calling capture. The church has been captured by the state, and this is because of the benefits. You know, the church of 80s, 90s was actually speaking truth to power. And because of that, the state had a lot of problems. Because there are people questioning, asking serious questions about rigging, about extrajudicial killings. But now the state realized that if you want to perpetrate all these things silently, when nobody is talking, then capture the church. Capture the church, and then they will not raise these serious issues, and your leadership will be smooth.
Thank you, Doc. Let's appreciate that group. Now to invite Violet Alinda, whose discussion was held in the tent, to give us a summary of their session. Social movements and their role in Africa's democratization. 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. So from our group, we had quite a bit of a conversation. We discussed a lot in terms, the first thing was we were given the history of how the social movements have evolved over time, right from the pre-colonial time, talking about the colonial period, talking through the post-colonial era, and of course the most recent dynamic around how these things look like. But again, the question that was posed to us was whether we needed to define what social movements are, because we felt, some participants felt that there was need for that conceptual clarity. But the more we think about it, we're asking ourselves, do we need to define it? Maybe describe what these things are. Why? Because they can be formal, they could be informal, they could be issue-based, but also they could be built around a number of other dynamics in terms of religious, economic, and also there was a question raised around the dogmatization of social movements, whether or not they should be affiliated to politics. But of course the counter-argument to that would be, is it possible to contest or challenge and you do not interface with power? And every time you're talking about power, probably there is a dynamic of politics behind it. So we think probably something that as long as these groupings or these movements are focusing on social change, then probably they do qualify to be called social movements. We tend to, personally, I look at them like an amoeba that keeps changing depending on the dynamic they are faced with. But again, we also had a conversation around the digital repression in view of the online or the online activism. And we also had other conversations around funding, the flexibility of funding. We also had the conversations around the elite capture in terms of where you have members in the civil society that predominantly take over these structures, but they are not rooted. And so the conversations stay up and they're excluding the would-be participants, and so they are not broad-based. But also we had another conversation that was quite interesting, where we see that while these movements need funding, we also need to hold the funders accountable to see whether we can balance or whether there can be that striking that accountability in terms of, apart from them advancing their interests, business interests or economic interests, to keep an eye on how whatever the states they support are stifling the growth of social movements, because we seem to see aid playing that dual role. The other thing that came through for us is there are some of the actions that we are thinking need to be done. One of them, that we need to build a culture of ownership and grassroots organizing so that they have clear strategies that cannot easily be swayed by whoever is giving them money. That would allow us to grow stronger, structured, and effective movements. But also it would allow us to have them consistent. The gentleman, the professor from DRC, shared an example of Lucha, a social movement which is very indigenous, where members are there because they believe in the same values, they have the same belief systems, they are driven purely by the passion of what the movement is about. And members are recruited after being trained, and they are not being funded externally. And we're told it's probably one of the best. Maybe we should interest ourselves in studying more about it, because maybe that points us to us having social movements that are more legitimate, that can easily be listened to by the power centers. You will recall in the morning we had this conversation of, at least all the presidents spoke about the fear. There's something fierce. At some point they all feared something, which meant that we need to address that fear if these social movements are going to be impactful and maybe be integrated, especially if we're speaking about the democratization process, to have those values entrenched. We also had another conversation that had to do with co-optation. We've seen activists being drawn into the public offices, being rewarded, and which means there's a bit of brain drain. There would be people in there end up getting into another space. So then the question becomes, how do we do that? But we're not able to resolve it. I think it's something that should continue to be explored. The other thing that we talked about is to do with the digital repression, where we need to consistently deal with the misinformation. And we're told about the counter-surveillance strategies, but also knowing that our governments are really advanced. They have ways of hacking anything with advanced technology. But also we are being urged to really be on top of our game and to counter that, that surveillance, so that we're on top of that game. And lastly, we were asking ourselves the question, of whether social movement activists or the people therein should not be having genuine interest in politics. If we are saying that we need to diffuse, to separate politics from social movements. Because the question, what is wrong with an activist or a social movement person wanting to become a politician? Especially if they are going to live by the ethos and the beliefs that they have set apart. They defined to. But also one of the most important comments that was made towards the end was the idea that once these social movements have been formed and they have defined their belief systems, when they get the opportunity to move into power or to take on those responsibilities, on the understanding that they have a certain belief system, we should be able to hold them to those values, because we are reflecting on some of our governments that initially came in with all these good intentions, with those they sold us certain beliefs. We will do this, we'll believe in this, we'll maintain the term limits, we'll change leaders, and they never lived to that. And now we have to deal with processes of reversing some of those decisions that we made way back in a very difficult and more challenging environment. I think those are the key things I picked on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Violet. And now, for the fourth group, we will listen to Dr. Therese Azeng, who is going to speak, who's going to present in French. So please, those of you, as if I am not amongst you, those of you who do not comprehend French, écoutez.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. I will just give you a few seconds to put your interpreter. Okay. I was part of, I've been appointed as rapporteur for group panel 4, talking about is digital revolution a friend or foe of democratization on African continent. Bon, j'ai dit ça en anglais, maintenant je peux virer au français. Voilà, c'est mieux. Bonsoir à tous. Donc, comme je l'ai dit, le 4e panel de ce jour visait à réfléchir sur une question un peu polémique, de penser à la révolution digitale comme étant un avantage ou alors un inconvénient de la démocratisation en Afrique. Nous avions 4 présentateurs qui étaient chargés de nous entretenir sur ces questions-là. Le premier venait du Bénin, Claude Biao. Le deuxième d'Égypte, Dr Rami Gaddi. Troisième était une dame venant de Eswatini, Lengiwe Portag Dlamini. Et enfin, un papier venant de Madagascar du docteur Ida Razafindra Koto. Désolée, Ida. L'ensemble de ces papiers a permis à la fin d'introduire de nombreuses discussions de participants venant du Sénégal, du Nigeria, du Cameroun, etc. Et donc, je vais présenter globalement ce qu'on a pu construire au fil des discussions, donc sans aller forcément d'un papier à un autre. En règle générale, lorsqu'on pose la question du rôle du digital ou de la révolution digitale dans la démocratisation, on peut penser de prime abord que c'est une excellente chose, du fait que l'espace digital est un espace par essence, par définition virtuel, donc qui est plus ouvert à la participation ou alors à la prise de position, à la prise de parole et à une plus grande audience. Donc, de prime abord, la digitalisation est une bonne chose pour le processus démocratique en Afrique et même ailleurs, d'ailleurs. Seulement, même si beaucoup d'exemples ont permis de démontrer dans certains pays comme le Sénégal, comme la Côte d'Ivoire, comme le Mali, certains autres pays aussi qui ont été suscités, la digitalisation a malheureusement certains inconvénients que les présentateurs ont tenu à démontrer et que je vais présenter ici. D'abord, le réseau social est essentiellement un réseau virtuel et l'ensemble des discussions ont permis de le démontrer. Il y a généralement une difficulté à passer de l'espace virtuel à l'espace réel. Donc lorsqu'on parle d'activisme, cela n'est pas encore de la vraie participation politique parce qu'on a généralement du mal. On parle ici des questions de jeunes parce que l'audience ici principale ou alors les plus grands acteurs sur le monde digital, ce sont les jeunes. Nous l'avons vu ce matin avec les présentations faites par les anciens chefs d'État qui étaient présents ici. Donc, ce passage-là, ce pont à trouver entre le virtuel et le réel manque encore et cela fait l'objet d'une réflexion qu'il faudra envisager d'un certain point de vue. Mais seulement, on peut être d'accord que les réseaux sociaux ont donné de l'espace aux jeunes de se faire entendre leur voix et de faire connaître leurs actions, à la fois sur le terrain, mais aussi créer de nouvelles aspirations pour eux de ce qu'ils veulent de leur avenir et de l'avenir que nous voulons tous. Mais en réalité, la présence sur les réseaux sociaux n'est pas toujours faite uniquement pour ceux qui ont des pensées ou alors des idéologies vertueuses. Les réseaux sociaux sont aussi un espace de propagande pour les groupes extrêmes, les groupes extrémistes et même les groupes les plus dangereux. Nous l'avons vu dans le papier présenté par le chercheur béninois qui parlait de la propagande politique ou alors la propagande extrémiste du fait des groupes rebelles comme l'État islamique dans la zone du Sahel. Parce que ce sont des groupes par essence qui ont su ou alors qui ont compris bien avant les États, et c'est l'une des conclusions phares de son papier, que le fait d'être présent sur les réseaux sociaux et de marteler un discours vous fait plus visible et peut toucher plus d'audience que ceux qui restent dans la communication formelle. Il a dans son papier montré la dichotomie qui existe entre la communication gouvernementale et la communication des groupes terroristes comme l'État islamique en prenant l'exemple du Sahel. On voit donc que l'espace digital peut à la fois servir pour différents groupes, donc il faut occuper l'espace et de manière appropriée pour prendre le dessus sur la lutte qui se passe non seulement sur les champs de bataille, mais aussi sur l'espace virtuel. Donc, en réalité aussi, la communication d'État n'est pas toujours la plus vertueuse qu'on puisse trouver, ou alors la plus bonne pour ses propres populations, parce que de la même manière, dans certains cas, les États ont compris que le digital a beaucoup de pouvoir, mais c'est aussi un moyen de la capture même du pouvoir. Le papier sur l'Égypte nous a permis de démontrer que le pouvoir en Égypte est fortement militarisé ou alors militaire, comme nous le savons, et ils ont compris que grâce au digital, ils pouvaient à la fois conquérir le pouvoir médiatique, le pouvoir de l'information, le pouvoir financier, le pouvoir social et même le pouvoir politique, à travers la capture des lois normales sur la liberté d'expression, sur la liberté financière, sur la liberté même d'expression. L'État peut se servir du monde digital pour capturer le pouvoir ou alors la liberté citoyenne qu'elle propose ou alors qu'elle veut promouvoir. Donc il faut faire attention à comment est-ce qu'on entend la digitalisation, parce qu'elle peut être instrumentalisée à la fois par les groupes les plus dangereux, mais aussi par certains États autocratiques ou même ceux qui se veulent démocratiques. Parce qu'à la fin des discussions aujourd'hui, comme on l'a dit tout à l'heure, qu'est-ce que la démocratie? Tout le monde parle de démocratie et tout le monde se veut démocratique. Et le troisième papier qui nous a été présenté l'a dit également, il vient du royaume de l'Eswatini. En règle générale, on sait que la démocratie dans les royaumes, c'est un peu compliqué puisque vous ne pouvez pas, par essence, promouvoir le changement à la tête de l'État puisque, par définition, nous sommes dans un royaume. Et donc, dans le cas de l'Eswatini, heureusement, les jeunes ont trouvé un moyen d'expression pour faire entendre leur voix par la mobilisation sur les réseaux sociaux. Malheureusement, à la fin de sa présentation, la chercheure qui nous a fait cette brillante présentation a démontré que les résultats ne sont pas encore atteints au niveau où les jeunes pourraient l'espérer, mais peut-être le gap, c'est de passer justement, comme je l'ai dit, du virtuel au réel pour arriver au résultat qu'on veut. Mais l'espace digital a déjà servi à montrer aux jeunes qu'ils ne sont pas tout seuls, que les problématiques qu'ils poursuivent sont également celles poursuivies par d'autres jeunes au sein du royaume, mais aussi au sein de la sous-région, au sein de l'Afrique et même au sein du monde entier. Donc, leurs aspirations restent légitimes de ce point de vue-là. Donc, même si les États les moins démocratiques récupèrent l'espace digital, qu'est-ce qu'il faut faire concrètement pour passer entre les mailles du filet? Et c'était le rôle du dernier papier qui nous venait de Madagascar, qui démontrait que les jeunes, ou alors les activistes, ont trouvé un moyen de contournement de cette capture d'état-là, qui est celle de l'art visuel notamment, par le dessin. Par le dessin politique de manière brute, comme on peut le voir dans certaines démocraties à travers le monde. Mais à Madagascar, les jeunes dessinateurs, ce qu'on a appelé les artivistes, donc les artistes qui sont aussi des activistes, les artivistes passent plutôt par des messages subliminaux qu'ils font passer à travers les médias de presse, mais aussi à travers les réseaux sociaux, où ils font passer des messages de contestation de manière subliminale, encore une fois, où ils font passer des messages de revendication de manière plus ou moins subliminale, où ils font passer des messages de revendication. Donc c'est un nouveau style de communication qui émerge à la fois dans des États où la communication politique n'est pas encore assez ouverte ou alors est fortement réprimée. Donc on voit qu'à travers l'utilisation des réseaux sociaux, les contextes sont différents en Afrique, mais le chemin est le même. Nous allons vers la démocratisation et chacun l'utilise de point de vue qui puisse l'arranger. Et comme je l'ai dit, les discussions ont permis de ressortir des expériences de certains pays où, par exemple au Nigeria, l'État utilise le vide juridique qui existe à travers certaines lois pour faire passer des lois répréhensibles pour les activistes sur les réseaux sociaux. Donc, il faut faire justement encore une fois attention à comment est-ce qu'on comprend la grande révolution digitale que nous tous nous appelons. Même si, dernièrement, on l'a vu au Sénégal, grâce à la mobilisation populaire qui a été initiée à travers les réseaux sociaux, on a pu avoir un arrêt de tentative de déstabilisation démocratique. On peut néanmoins s'interroger sur comment construire encore une fois le pont entre mobilisation et activisme, entre mobilisation sur les réseaux sociaux et véritable participation citoyenne. Donc le débat est encore ouvert, le débat continue, mais ce sont des questions qui nous ont intéressés et qui ont démontré beaucoup de bonnes choses dans ce panel. Je vais m'arrêter là vu que le modérateur est déjà debout et que je ne voudrais pas qu'il ait mal aux pieds. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Je suis content. Je suis content.
We have come to the end of day one, at least the formal end of day one. Congratulate yourselves for making it through day one. Just to say a little bit about this evening, we're going to go into a tea break now, but we're all asked to convene for dinner around 7 o'clock. There'll also be a special guest for dinner this evening. The organizers of this have been very intentional about trying to make this as a space that is as interactive as possible, and so there's going to be a lot of opportunity for us to interact with each other and network within the space, which is really, really important, I think. I wanted to just give us a sense of, I think, some of the things to mull on today as we go into tomorrow, because tomorrow morning we're going to have two sessions that are going to both be in plenary, and I choose to call them the sessions about the human resourcing that we need when we're going to rethink democracy. The first session, we're going to be talking about intellectuals and the space, the role of the public intellectual in Africa. And in the second session, we're going to be talking about Africa, the African diaspora and their role. But I think both sessions give us an opportunity to reflect on the people who need to engage in the work of rethinking democracy and doing democracy differently going forward. And that includes us. Especially tomorrow morning, that first session, and in some cases even that second session, for some of us who are in the diaspora. We must think about what our role is going to be in shaping democracy and driving democracy into the future. Democracy is not something that's going to be changed and shaped by someone out there, particularly not by those who are elected as the primacy of our democracy. Democracy is going to be changed with a whole society approach. And I think one of the things that came out for me today is the need for us to interrogate our role as civil society, as academia, as intelligentsia, and be very honest and brave about the state of our work and how we need to change our work if we're going to change the future of democracy. So that's the first reflection that I want us to take with us into the evening and into tomorrow morning. The second reflection came from our panel this morning, which surprisingly for the elders amongst us was about the role of the youth and the role of young people and how we are going to enable and create space for young people. One of the agitations that I've started to provoke in my own country is the question of if democracy and representation really matter to us, and we know that 60% of our population is under the age of 35, how many of us are ready to be led by a 35-year-old? How many of us are ready to be led by the youth of the continent? And if we are not, why? Are we not producing conducive environments for young people to not just be the demographic dividend for jobs, but be the demographic dividend for leadership? And I think that that's a conversation I think we should pull through the rest of our time together in the next 2 days. And then the final conversation is a conversation I want to call whose democracy is it anyway? And I think the last presenter kind of started to speak about that. But I think in all of our discussions today, the question of who has power and who doesn't have power has come up. And at the core, democracy is about us being able to govern ourselves, but governing requires power. And so we must start to have reflective conversations about who has power, what kind of power do they have, and how do we actually change the way power works. In our session where we were talking about the issues-based politics, the big obstacle that came into the room was money, and saying that politics is run by elites. And my challenge to us is that we are also part of those elites. There's money in our work and in our lives as well. But I think we must figure out what are the other modes of power in our society. What do we do with mass power? Where has people's power gone to? What do we do with the power of our intellectual abilities and our power in the global economies, our power in geopolitics and the shifting geopolitics of our world? So those are my 3 conversations I'm provoking us to think about overnight and into tomorrow. Our role that we are going to play as a sector on the continent when it comes to driving democracy, the space and the role of young people that we are willing to enable, and also the question about who has power and how do we change power dynamics going forward. So I hope that that helps us think through things. I hope we're going to have deep debates going deep into the night. Deep into the night, many things can happen, but I'm hoping that the most important thing that happens is debate. I think that's us for now. We'll start tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp. We'll do an engagement with the rapporteur who will give us a bit of a brief on today. But also importantly, as we get into the afternoon session tomorrow, we're going to be talking about the outcomes document of this engagement, and that needs to be an action-based thing that we also have to think about. So tomorrow morning, if we can start 9 o'clock sharp, we must make sure that the morning goes through smoothly, so the afternoon we can have robust debates about what our joint plan of action is. Thank you, everybody, for today. Please enjoy dinner.